the other people that are attending this workshop. I guess that today we will have to deal with rationality. So my guess is that there are also heuristics that are not rational. Maybe the ones that use the politicians to get votes. But we will see. This is my guess. You will confirm or falsify my guess. So the first presentation is given by Seselja and Strasser, but it seems to me that there is also another name. Yeah, Wieland.
Yes,
and the title is Scientific Disagreement and Epistemic Tolerance. Another aspect not always present with the politicians. Epistemic tolerance. They come from Ghent in Belgium. So you have 45 minutes about, and then there will be the discussion.
Thank you. Okay, so we will present this talk jointly, so I will just give a couple of introductory words, and then Christian will say, have a first half of the talk, and then I will again jump in. So let me first try to, first of all, I would like to thank Emiliano for organizing the workshop and for the beautiful organization. The hotel and everything has been really splendid, so we are really happy to be here. Okay, so let me now try and link this topic of rational disagreement and epistemic toleration to the topic of this workshop. So how is this totally related to the heuristics? One of the topics, as you all know, which philosophers of science have been concerned with is the topic of theory choice. The question, how are we to evaluate scientific theories and how are we to judge them? Are they performing well or not? This question has for a long time been approached as an epistemic justification, mainly as a justification of theories in terms of standard set of epistemic values, such as consistency, explanatory power, unification, etc. However, since the late 70s, 80s, certain scholars have indicated that this flat epistemic justification is not really appropriate type of evaluation which we should perform for the theories which are at the frontier of science. So newly developing scientific theories require a different type of assessment. So scholars such as Thomas Nichols and Larry Loden have indicated that there is a different type of appraisal required for these young scientific theories, namely heuristic appraisal, or investigation of whether theories are worthy of further pursuit. We are not interested whether they have performed well up to now, we are interested primarily in the question, what should we do from now on? Are they worthy of further investigation? So Christian and I have been working now for a couple of years on the question of normative frameworks of inquiring into this heuristic appraisal. What criteria can we use in order to judge whether a theory is worthy of pursuit? And we have developed a framework and we have had some examples. But one of the questions which we have constantly been confronted with when we would present the talks on this topic was the question, okay, so let's say we have a situation in which we have two scientists. One scientist evaluates, works in one paradigm, let's say, and evaluates another paradigm as worthy of pursuit. But what if these two scientists come from two incommensurable paradigms, and what if they actually disagree among each other? What if one scientist thinks there is something essentially problematic about this other paradigm, how can I evaluate it as worthy of pursuit? What should I do in this situation? And that is how we came to the topic of rational disagreement. So the rational disagreement became one of the key obstacles for our research on heuristic appraisal because we were not sure what is an appropriate normative framework that scientists can use in this situation. And that is what this topic is about. So Christian can now present now the first part of our paper.
Okay, so I will start with some introductory themes. So just some basic threads to connect to that topic. And then I will talk a little bit about rational disagreements, and that will hopefully lead us directly to the main topic, which is epistemic tolerance, which Dunia will then capture. So the basic situation which we are confronted with looks as follows. So you have two camps of scientists, or two scientists, each of them has a certain commitment towards a stance. So on the left-hand side, the stance is S. On the right-hand side, the famous nuclear physicist, Mr. Burns, he has the stance T. Both have a commitment towards their stance, but they disagree. So they also have a kind of negative commitment or a critical commitment towards the stance of the other. So what scientific pluralists tell us in such situations, at least in some such situations, is that one of them or both of them should tolerate each other. Now, you see there's a certain tension here. On the one hand, we speak about toleration, which implies that we should take the other stance as somewhat admissible. We have to still talk about what admissibility we are really interested in here, but there's some sense of admissibility here. And on the other hand, we have a commitment towards our own stance, and thus a critical commitment towards the other stance. So this critical commitment on the one hand and the admissibility which tolerance implies, that gives a certain tension. And this tension we are interested in this topic. So, and as of course, this poses certain questions to, for instance, scientific pluralists. So for instance, what is the epistemic nature exactly of this tension I was just talking about? What does it mean then to tolerate the other, really, more precisely? And in which situation should we tolerate? We of course don't want a willy-nilly tolerance where anything goes. At least some don't want that, some others do, maybe. But, so that was the first tension. There's a second tension, somewhat connected to the first tension. And that appears if you ask the question, so let's say Lisa asks the question on the left-hand side, so why at all should I tolerate the position of Mr. Burns? After all, I disagree with him, and I think he's wrong. So what would a scientific pluralist say in such a situation? So one possible answer is, well, it's just because you have a perspective, he has a perspective, we all just have perspective, so we are all on equal footing in some sense, and that's why we should all tolerate each other, right? But that's a little bit of a problematic answer, I would say, because if you just say, oh, this is all just a perspective, you somehow undermine the positive commitment these agents have towards their own stance, and thus the critical commitment they have towards the other stance. If I insist on my positive commitment, of course I cannot just say this is just another perspective. I say this is another perspective, and I think my perspective is right. So, in a sense, we're bracketing our positive commitment if we just advise these people, yeah, well, just take it as another perspective, just among many perspectives which are all on equal footing. So, for instance, Levi Bryant says, the pluralist who argues like that paradoxically calls for every perspective to abandon its perspective, thereby abolishing the very thing that makes a perspective a perspective. A similar criticism could be launched towards pluralism, which says, yeah, what is tolerance? Well, basically just indifference. Just be indifferent towards the other one, just work on your own thing, right? But again, that doesn't take the critical commitment we have towards the other really serious. Because if I have a critical commitment, of course I want to criticize the other one and want to say, hey, you're wrong. So, again, you're just bracketing the positive commitment these people have towards their own stance, and thus the critical commitment they have towards the other stance. So, the message here would be, pluralism has to take the commitment of its agents serious. Is that possible? Well, we try to answer yes, but we will see how. So, I already announced, well, disagreement is a very important issue, for instance, for pluralists, because it's kind of the touchstone of pluralism. As long as you have no friction, it comes easy, right? Pluralism comes easy. We just have coexistence, no friction, no problem. But as soon as we have disagreement, it becomes difficult. And especially we're interested in rational disagreement, because as long as we have very good reasons to suppose the other one is irrational, well, then we have good reasons, at least prima facie, to disregard the other stance. So rational disagreement seems rather interesting for pluralists. So thus, I will say a little bit about rational disagreement in the following slides. First, let's give a very schematic definition of what that is. It's very schematic. It just says, well, there's a disagreement concerning some issue, let's say A, and there are reasons to suppose that the stance of each of the participants is the result of a rational deliberation. So they both have a certain rationality. Okay, that's very schematic. Of course, this can be specified in various ways. So first of all, you could, and that is often done in epistemology, we could talk about peer disagreement. So what are epistemic peers? Epistemic peers, usually they are defined as having similar intellectual capacities, having similar access to evidence. That's what we roughly usually have in scientific disagreements. And then maybe more interesting specification is the difference between external and internal recognition of the second point here. So the question is, who recognizes whether these stances are the result of a rational deliberation? Is it the participants themselves who are in a controversy, or is it some external viewer? An external viewer like a historian or a philosopher of science. So we speak about an external rational disagreement if the rationality of the disagreement is recognized from external, and we talk about an internal one if this is recognized from the perspective of the participants themselves. Next question, is something like rational disagreement at all possible? Well, a long time in the philosophic... Oh, this is very hard to read. Maybe we can...
Yeah. Is it this one?
Yeah. Okay, sorry. So, a long time in literary philosophy that might have been something like, whoa, rational disagreement, that sounds really weird. We don't believe in something like that. So for instance, according to the Leibnizian ideal, what Jordan calls the Leibnizian ideal, you always have a tiebreaker. Whenever you have a controversy, you just have to look close enough to your evidence, and then by scrutiny, you can somehow see what position is really better. You just have to look at your evidence. So he says all disputes about matters of fact can be resolved by invoking appropriate rules of evidence. That would be the Leibnizian ideal. Of course, that is in stark contrast to what some other philosophers of science, more contemporaries, say about such situations. So for instance, Jordan here. It is frequently true, for instance, that scientists who are doing their best to follow appropriate norms of disinterestedness, objectivity, and rationality nonetheless find themselves led to very divergent conclusions. So that's rational disagreement. So the question is, what are the contenders of these Leibnizian ideals? Do we have good reasons to suppose that this is actually a wrong ideal? So I give you very quick now various reasons. You probably heard of all of them already before. So that's why I do it very, very quick. The first pack of reasons concerns evidence. So you all probably heard about under and over-determination. Under-determination probably is very clear. Over-determination is if you have too much evidence which is conflicting. And then, of course, you have different extrapolations of this evidence which are competing with each other. And it's not so clear, prima facie speaking, which of the extrapolations is the better one. Theory-ledness of evidence. Big theme in Kuhn, for instance. So, let's see what Rascher says, for instance. He says, constraints on evidence, the very thing the Leibnizian ideals wanted to use as a tiebreaker, constraints on evidence are useful devices for eliminating and reducing mistakes, but their operation leaves ample scope for disagreement and diversity. The other pack of reasons against the Leibnizian ideal concerns the rules and the values. Again, you have over-determination, under-determination. You may have many rules, many values at place. They compete with each other. It's not so clear how to aggregate them. Applications of rules are themselves, at least at some level, not rule-governed anymore. That's the Kripkean theme in his book on Wittgenstein. Kant already had similar things. Also, you have theory-ledness of values. So what could that mean? For instance, if you take a term as simplicity, what does simplicity mean? Sometimes this may be somewhat indexical. The semantics of the word simplicity may be indexical in the sense that we need paradigmatic examples of simplicity to which we refer to in order to give proper meaning to the term simplicity. For instance, take other values, you will find similar examples. And the last block of reasons against the Leibnizian ideals, and maybe the most important ones, concerns attacks on the concept of rationality, which is a monistic one. So there are authors who actually argue that we need a pluralism of rationality. So for instance, Rascher. He says, what is rational is by no means uniform from person to person, but variable with situation and context. He says, but people's substantivity-led epistemic standards, what he calls the criteria of plausibility, they grow out of the individual experiential histories and give rise to different cognitive perspectives. Similar, Magnani, he wrote the book on rational disagreement. He says, since personal histories of problem solving differ, competently reasoning experts can disagree because they have different rationales. And last but not least, you have Lawton. He has this reticulated model of scientific rationality. So you have these three levels: method, aims, and theories, how we talk about facts. And he says these things are not ordered hierarchically, but they are ordered in a kind of triangle. And what is rational is a kind of coherent equilibrium state here. So the method should somewhat nicely cohere with the aims of science. The method should nicely justify the theories. So what you want is really a kind of fixed point here, which is a nice coherent equilibrium. And he says, but this, what counts as an equilibrium state, that may very much differ, diachronical through the history of science as well as synchronical through different camps of science. So we have seen now what is rational disagreement. We have seen there are some kind of a priori reasons why it is possible. We have also seen that philosophers of science, I didn't really talk much about it, but for instance, there's Ha-Seok Chang. He wrote just recently a book on the chemical revolution, so the fight between Priestley and Lavoisier, and he argues that this is a kind of a situation where you have a rational disagreement. I will come to that later. So there are many philosophers of science, historians of science, who wrote books where they pinpoint cases where they argue have something like a rational disagreement. So you see from an external perspective, there were pinpointed cases where philosophers say this is a rational disagreement. But the question now appears, can we pinpoint such cases, or can we recognize such cases also from an internal perspective? So if I'm a participant in a debate, can I say, okay, this seems like a rational disagreement? Are there good reasons for that? Or am I always somehow captured in my worldview? So internal recognition is the next problem I will talk about. And there's this interesting quote by Magnani, which somewhat gives us a problem here. So what he says is one of the defining features of reasonable disagreement in politics, so that's his topic, he talks about politics, but what he says here as well applies to rational disagreements in general. He says one of the defining features is that the contending positions do not seem equally reasonable to the parties themselves, despite the fact that all are reasoning competently. So from an external perspective, you have a rational disagreement, but the people who are participating in the very debate, they don't think this is a rational disagreement, because they don't seem equally reasonable to them, the positions. So this means that the contending positions will not seem equally reasonable to the reader, or at least to a reader who is engaged with the issue. An engaged reader will be engaged on one of the competing sides and regard the reasoning supporting the opposing sides as mistaken. So, simpler and in more simple words, it means either you're an expert in the debate and you already took a side and you're convinced that the other side is simply wrong and thus insufficiently rational, or if you're not an expert, well then you're just not adequately informed to make a proper judgment about the issue. So that seems like an impossibility argument for the internal recognition of a rational disagreement, if that is right. So what we propose in our paper is two packs of indices which still could be used for participants in a debate to at least tentatively conclude that they may be in a position which is a rational disagreement. So the first pack of indices we call the content-based indices, because they are gained by analyzing the argumentative content of the controversy. So this is something which is usually done by historians or by philosophers of science. So I give an example here with Ha-Seok Chang. I already mentioned it. In his new book, he analyzes the chemical revolution. So what are the things he's interested in here? So for instance, he analyzes that they have a different weighing of values. For instance, simplicity and completeness. Lavoisierians, Priestlians, or however you want to call them, they apply these values in rather different ways. They weigh them in different ways. you have a different way of what means that a problem is interesting or important. You have different way of what is a proper solution to a problem. And you have different applications of the very same values, such as unity or systematicity. So his punchline is, there was a genuine methodological incommensurability, like in Kuhn, between the two systems of chemistry. And he argues, strikingly, that Joseph Priestley was not irrational. And he didn't cease to be a scientist, as Kuhn says, according to Trump. He was not irrational or unreasonable in his resistance to Lavoisierian chemistry proposition. So he says this was a rational disagreement, and the ways he analyzes it is by these content-based indices. But now, this was an external analysis, right? You remember I was interested in, can we internally recognize a rational disagreement? So the question is now, are these kind of features available to participants in the debate? And so, if you take the ecstatic view, then yes, the ecstatic view is the one which Trump proposes. He says, well, we have all learned to see the duck and then the rabbit. That's the Wittgensteinian duck-rabbit head. So you can flip it. You can see it as a duck or as a rabbit. It is harder to learn to flip the Necker cube back and forth, but most of us can do it. We can even learn to think simultaneously in terms of different systems. So he says we just need to put some effort into it, and we can see the world through the eyes of our opponents. That's the ecstatic view. Now, of course, there are contenders of that view. And then the other extreme would be the anesthetic view, according to which scientists are essentially locked within their own view. So if you want to switch from one camp to the other, if you want to see the world through the eyes of the other, what you actually have to run through is a conversion process. But once you're converted to the other camp, you cannot switch back anymore. That's the view Kuhn, for instance, forwards as indestructible. So another another proponent of that view is Baltus. So I will not go through the whole quote here. The idea is just that scientists have certain background assumptions, and background assumptions he takes in a very Wittgensteinian sense. These are kind of hinge propositions who is familiar with like the Wittgenstein, who not so important. The point is that these background assumptions are in no position to lay bare on the table of discussion. They cannot make them transparent during the discussion. They have a silent existence, and they can only be determined only ex post facto, after the assumption has been disclosed and from a new vantage point created by the disclosure itself. So while they're discussing, while they're engaged into the controversy, they cannot do that. So that was also the view of the first quote I gave you by Magnani. So I don't want to take sides now between the ecstatic or the anesthetic view. You can pick your side. I'm somewhere in the middle, I guess. But the point is, if they are somewhat right, at least in some cases, then this poses clear problems on the internal recognition of rational disagreement, and especially on the recognition of this what we call content-based indices. So it would be nice to have another pack of indices which are less controversial, right? Which are easier to recognize. So what we propose here is form-based indices. So form-based indices you gain by looking at the history of a dispute. They are not so much gained by looking at the argumentative structure, but rather at the dispute itself. So, for instance, in how many, if a certain property pops up in a number of different contexts, if it survives extended debate, conducted in good faith, then, so Magnani, you have some basis for supposing that the disagreement is grounded in competent reasoning, or in other words, that it is a rational disagreement. So note here some basis for supposing. That is a very, very weak form. That's very tentative. But still it gives us a kind of weak reason to suppose that there may be an irrational disagreement just by looking at the very debate and how it evolved. So in our paper we propose some other properties along that lines. So for instance, how strong is the expertise of the different people rowing up at the two sides of the controversy? What is the number of experts on the two sides, and similar indices. So these indices, they are kind of objectively out there because everybody can look at the history of a dispute, can see how long it is, what's the expertise of the people on the two sides by publication records and so on and so forth. There's nothing controversial here. But they are much more tentative in nature. Okay. So now I gave you reasons why we can suppose that there are rational disagreements. I said something about their recognition. At the very end, I want to say a little bit about the epistemic structure of such rational disagreements. So why is that important? That is important because after all, we're interested in a kind of normative framework which tells us something about what are these people who are engaged in such a situation, what should they do? And we want to develop this notion of epistemic tolerance, so you should be really informed by the epistemic nature of the very situation you're looking at. So what's the epistemic nature of a rational disagreement? In order to shed some light on that, we found it helpful to look at or to find similar situations in epistemology. And two of situations which are rather similar are the lottery paradox and the preface paradox. So I will now give a kind of analogy argument between the lottery paradox, the preface paradox, and rational disagreement. So I will start with the lottery and the preface paradox and then move on to rational disagreement. So what's the scenario in these two cases? I don't tell you yet what's paradoxical, I will come to that, but just a scenario. So in the lottery paradox, you have a big ball of tickets. Let's say 1 million, or if that's too little for you, 1 billion tickets. One ticket will be chosen. That's the scenario. In the preface paradox, suppose you wrote a really thick book with lots of really difficult arguments, very involved arguments. Suppose mathematical proofs which are complicated, or logical book or something like that. Now for each single argument, you suppose that it is correct. Why? Because you check-read the book over and over again, maybe you gave it to your colleagues to check-read it, and your last few check readings were really so that nobody found a mistake. Okay, that's the scenario in the preface paradox. The lottery paradox goes back to Kyber, the preface paradox goes back to Mackensen, as far as I know. So now to the paradoxical structure. First of all, you have a positive commitment in both cases. So in the first case, the lottery paradox, you have a positive commitment. Give me a number I, and I have very good reasons to believe that the ticket with the number I will not be chosen. The probability is 1 under a million, or 1 under a billion if that is too little for you to say you have a good reason to believe that it will not be chosen. Most of our beliefs have a much, much lower probability. Or, in the preface paradox, give me any single argument in the book, give me any single proof in the book. I have very good reasons to suppose that this proof is correct, because I check-read it. But there is also negative commitment. The negative commitment in the case of the lottery paradox is, after all, we know one ticket will be chosen. And in the preface paradox, we also know by experience that such big books always contain mistakes. It's just nearly impossible that this book doesn't have a mistake, right? So what's paradoxical about these situations? The paradoxical part is that there's a tension between the positive commitment and the negative commitment. Abstractly speaking, the negative commitment blocks us from universalizing the positive commitment. So what does this mean? So for instance, in the lottery paradox, although you have for each single ticket the belief that it will not be chosen, you cannot aggregate these beliefs to the belief that no ticket will be chosen, because after all, you know one ticket will be chosen. So you can see you cannot put the odd quantifier in front of this statement that each single ticket will be such that it will not be chosen. And the preface paradox is similar. You cannot conclude from the fact that give me any of the proofs. I think I have good reasons to believe it's justified and correct, but still I cannot generalize that or universalize it to the knowledge that the book in general contains no error whatsoever. One important thing here is that although you have this negative commitment, it doesn't fully render the positive commitment invalid. The positive commitment is still there. So if I, for instance, decide to write another paper, I can still rely on the arguments, on the proofs from the book, because after all, I check-read them. I can still rely on this positive commitment I have. I can just not universalize it in the sense as I described it just now. So let's look at rational disagreement. Why is this a similar situation in some sense? So we have to identify now a positive commitment, a negative commitment, and a certain tension. So the positive commitment is rather obvious. I have a positive commitment toward my stance, right? Because I think I'm justified in my very stance. And that immediately includes a critical commitment towards the stance of the other, because I disagree with the other. So that's PC. What's NC? NC says, well, after all, because I'm in a rational disagreement. That's the presupposition here. I'm in a rational disagreement, so I have, after all, some reasons to suppose that the stance of the other one is, after all, rational, and thus it may be not effective in any logical, epistemological, methodological, or what have you, relevant way. That's a negative commitment. What's the tension? The tension is that the negative commitment again seems to undermine the universalization of my very stance as the only rational one on this very topic. And thus, it prevents a full or final rejection of the opponent's stance, because after all, he may be rational. Similar as before, this negative commitment is not enough to render my positive commitment invalid. It still sustains the disagreement, my positive commitment towards my stance. So I'm still justified to rely on the commitment towards my stance in my further research, for instance. There is some other similarities, especially between the preface paradox and the rational disagreement, that concerns that both feature a certain epistemic blind spot. In the preface paradox, the blind spot is, well, I don't know exactly, is there a mistake really in the book? Although there are very good reasons to suppose so, and where is the mistake in the book? That falls in my epistemic blind spot. In the rational disagreement, I have a similar epistemic blind spot problem because I don't know exactly how my opponent is rational. If I would know, if it would be transparent to me that he is rational, then I would have to put his stance on equal footing with mine. And I couldn't have the strong commitment towards my stance. The disagreement would disappear. So there's an uncertainty, as I said before already, there's an essential uncertainty in the recognition of the other one as being also maybe rational, in the case of rational disagreement. So that's the epistemic structure of rational disagreement in analogy to these paradoxes as they are known from the field of epistemology. Now, Dunya will tell us more about epistemic tolerance.
Okay, so first of all, let us try to connect these two topics. How are we going to now go from rational disagreement to epistemic toleration? We would like to see why at all speaking of toleration here? What does this have to do with tolerance? So, let us recall this epistemic tension which Christian was just talking about. On the one hand, we have this PC, positive commitment, which says that a scientist is convinced of her own stance and thus finds the opponent's stance problematic. So, our scientist finds the opponent's stance objectionable in a certain sense. On the other hand, there is this negative commitment, NC, which tells us that there are certain indices in view of which, so content and form-based indices, in view of which we should suppose that our opponent may be rational after all. So the stance of our opponent is admissible in a certain sense. Of course, this doesn't resolve the tension, which the fact that the opponent's stance is admissible doesn't mean that my objection is any weaker. So I have to stand this. Finally, it's important to notice that the epistemic status of my opponent's stance is admissible, but it's not. It should not be. It should not be reduced. It should not be reduced to or. The status is not the same as the status of somebody whose stance I want to fully reject. That stance would be inadmissible. So if I have full problems with someone's stance, I just flatly reject it. That's not even admissible for me. So there is a difference. There are these three components. Now, an interesting thing is, which is how we came to the notion of toleration, is that these three components, objection, admission, and non-admission, are actually components which constitute the concept of toleration as it is usually discussed in the field of ethics and politics. For instance, Rainer Forst, German philosopher working in the field of ethics, exactly uses these three components to define the notion of toleration. We will come to that in a second. First of all, a Another interesting point to notice is that philosophers of science have moreover used emotional toleration when discussing scientific pluralism. So for instance, Chang, whom Christian has mentioned already, or Hugh Lacey, who has been more discussing the examples from applied sciences, have argued that scientists are to tolerate one another in certain cases of disagreement. However, no detailed account of what this epistemic toleration should be has been given. So let us now see, why should we at all speak of epistemic toleration? Isn't this maybe exactly the same as this ethical toleration? Here is the difference. Each of the three components which we have mentioned, objection, admission, and non-admission, are actually epistemic characters. They are essentially informed by epistemic values. So we have certain epistemic problem with the opponent's stance, and there are epistemic reasons why we want to consider our opponent as possibly rational. Moreover, the normative consequences of this epistemic toleration should be epistemic and methodological rather than ethical. So for instance, I may ethically tolerate some stance which I don't want epistemically to tolerate at all. So these are two different options. It's important to keep this difference in mind. Why is it significant to introduce this framework? First of all, the framework of epistemic toleration allows us to, in an apt way, normatively capture the tension which we have just mentioned, this tension which resembles the epistemic paradoxes. Secondly, it allows us to formulate epistemically and heuristically fruitful guidelines to a scientist who is involved in this situation. And finally, this type of admissibility, which toleration allows us to formulate, is a different one from the admissibility which has been so far present in epistemological and methodological toolkit, which is given by stances such as acceptance, pursuit worthiness, consideration, worthy of consideration, worthy of expectation, etc. Because first of all, none of these stances captures this very tension which we have spoken about. And secondly, each of these stances can themselves be the object of disagreement. So scientists can disagree about what is worthy of pursuit, what is worthy of consideration, or what acceptance. But what they should do in this situation is what is actually at stake. And that is what our framework of toleration is supposed to tell us. So let us present this framework. First of all, I would like to say a couple of words about toleration as it is formulated in the field of ethics and politics. So the Rainer Forst, whom I have mentioned already, indicates that, so he gives us three criteria which formulate the notion of toleration as a conditional norm. Once these three criteria have been satisfied, toleration is triggered, so to say. So first is the objection criterion. Tolerated beliefs or practices are considered objectionable and in an important sense wrong or bad. Second, there is an acceptance criterion. There are certain positive reasons that trump the negative ones in the relevant context. We still find this what we want to tolerate problematic, but there are certain reasons why we want to tolerate it. And finally, there is the rejection criteria. There are limits of toleration. So I'm not going to tolerate whatever. There are some statements or practices which I want to be tolerant towards, and there are limits of my toleration from the point from which on I stop being tolerant. Okay, so let us now try to translate these three components into the epistemic reality. First of all, objection criteria. The tolerated stance is considered objectionable and in an important sense epistemically problematic. This is our PC, or positive commitment. I'm committed to my own stance, and therefore I find, because I'm in a disagreement, I find the position of my opponent problematic. That's the objection which I have. Second, admission criterion. We don't speak of acceptance because acceptance has a specific meaning in philosophy of science, so we rather use the term admission. Admission criterion, which tells us that there are certain positive reasons, namely the indices of rational disagreement, in view of which it would be wrong not to tolerate this objection. This is our NC, or negative commitment. There are these reasons why I should let this be admissible, the stance of my opponent. And finally, what we call disavowal criterion. There are negative reasons to consider the stance of the opponent as futile and thus specify the limit, in view of this futility, specify the limits of toleration. So not any junk is going to be tolerable. There are limits of my epistemic toleration. So what does it now mean to deal in an epistemically responsible way be the tension between objection and admission. We argue in this paper that tolerance means acting in an epistemically responsible way relative to both sides of the tensional state of rational disagreement. And we formulate two norms. First norm tells us that we should treat the opponent's stance in a charitable way as potentially rational, that is, as potentially non-truthful. I'm going to explain what this comes down to. Just to first bring the second norm. The second norm has two parts. The first one tells us that we have a duty to consider the opponent's stance as a potentially serious competition and challenge to our own stance. So we have to treat it as a serious contender. The second part tells us that we have a duty to stay in a critical correspondence with the opponent. Okay, so the first norm. Why should we at all consider our opponent's stance as potentially non-futile, although we clearly disagree with the opponent? The disagreement is this PC component, the objection component. Well, we may be in a rational disagreement, in which case such a radical stance may lead to a premature, so the radical stance, complete rejection of my opponent, may lead to premature rejections and potentially fruitful inquiries. Now this may sound trivial. Of course I should not reject my opponent. I mean, maybe there is something good about that. But the reason why this is not trivial at all are examples from the history of science where scientists in the situations of scientific disagreement, of what we now call rational disagreement, have actually rendered each other epistemically futile. First example comes from the chemical revolution mentioned by Christian. So Chang has argued that phlogiston system was prematurely dismissed. That phlogiston should have been pursued exactly in the time when it was more or less abandoned. Only a couple of mavericks kept on researching it, but it wasn't at all researched in comparison to how fruitful it was, according to Chang. Second example regards the continental drift debate. So Alfred Wegener, our scientist at the beginning of the 20th century, has argued, he proposed the theory of continental drift. Nowadays we have a theory of plate tectonics. But back then, a number of North American earth scientists argued that this hypothesis was completely futile. So they spoke of Wegener's sliding circles. And they did that up to the 1950s in spite of the further research being done in this field. So in spite of a lot of more evidence coming in and new hypotheses supporting the theory, they rendered it, some scientists rendered it epistemically futile. Another interesting example is the example of agroecology, which Hugh Lacey has been discussing, which is in danger of being rendered epistemically futile. So some scientists working in agriculture are more convinced by genetic engineering. They have been arguing that we have to stick to this powerful tool of genetic engineering, which makes the whole field of agroecology just worthless. And these are these examples where our first norm of toleration has been violated. Now, what does it precisely mean to treat the stance of our opponent in a charitable way as potentially rational or non-futile? In the paper, we link this to the discussion in philosophy of language, where charity principle has been used for interpreting other languages, texts, etc., where the work of Quine, Davidson, and others is relevant. So the idea behind this research is that we should interpret this language, text of our opponent in the most consistent, truthful, rational way. Nevertheless, there have been critical responses to this. If we are going to interpret the text of our opponent in a fully consistent, truthful, rational way, we may first of all get an inadequate translation or understanding of this text, because as Taggart argues, we may, for instance, take Hegel. He intentionally has a number of inconsistencies, and now we try to interpret him in a consistent way. We are actually misunderstanding here something. Second, this may lead to a lack of criticism, because we may be too charitable towards our opponent. So we should not weaken our criticism fully. Hence, these authors have argued that we need a more empirically responsible forms of the charity principle. Our charity principle has to be, in some sense, empirically informed. It is important to notice that this discussion concerns our disavowal criterion. So the question, where are the borders of toleration? Because if there is a point where we should stop reading our opponent as rational, then this concerns exactly this disavowal criterion, the limits of our toleration. So Taggart, Nisbet, and Henderson have argued that it is too radical to assume, per default, that the mistake is always with the interpreter. It's not always a mistake with us. Sometimes our opponent will simply be wrong. They mainly focus on reasoning mistakes that are likely to have been committed, such as statistical reasoning, inductive reasoning, etc. Nevertheless, it is important to notice that this criterion, so finding mistakes in reasoning of our opponents, where they have called upon psychological and sociological studies which make it likely that our opponent is just making mistakes in reasoning in this case, taking this as a disavowal criterion would be too suboptimal for the case of scientific disagreement or rational disagreement in science. First of all, we are dealing with expertise, with scientists who, so to say, know their maths. As Taggart argues, it is not very likely that experts are going to commit this mistake, especially if there is a number of experts and they have checked read each other's research. So this is not what is usually at stake in rational disagreements. Moreover, if we have scientists deriving certain theoretical claims out of evidence, then the question what conclusions they are justified to draw may itself be part of the rational disagreement. For instance, in the disagreement between Galileo and Cardinal Balmain, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but...
Bellarmino.
How is it?
Bellarmino.
Bellarmino. Okay, thank you. What was the same? What was at stake was exactly the strength of the evidence which they were allowed to use in debate. Whether the biblical word or the observational evidence has the stronger value as an argument. So exactly what scientists are justified in drawing this conclusion may be what is at stake. So this as such is not enough to specify our disavowal criteria. What we can allow for, however, are empirical reasons which are neutral with respect to debate. So if we have some empirical studies which both parties in debate agree with and which give us good reasons to suppose that one of the two parties have made a mistake in reasoning, then this can count as a disavowal criterion. Other conditions for disavowal criteria may be empirically backed up reasons to suppose that our opponent has been biased or fraud has been committed, or for instance, our opponent, which Chang argues is an important criterion, if our opponent refuses to interact in an argumentative exchange. So we pose a certain challenge to our opponent and our opponent just doesn't care. Then we have certain reasons to suppose something is fishy here. Alright, so now let me explain the second norm of toleration. Recall that the second norm included 2 points. The first one is that we have a duty to consider the opponent's stance as potentially serious competition and a challenge to my own stance. And second, the duty to stay in a critical correspondence with the opponent. So we have to consider our opponents as a serious competitor, and second, we have to interact with the opponent. The first one, regarding the first point, because of the NC, the admission point, so the reasons in view of which I conclude that my opponent may be rational, together with PC, my positive critical commitment, this means that my opponent is a potential, poses for me potential competition and challenge. So I regard my opponent as epistemically rational, I disagree with them, hence this may be a serious challenge to my own stance. Now, in view, the second part of our norm can come out of various reasons. First of all, our positive, what we have called positive commitment, so the certain objections that I have towards my opponent come with a critical commitment. I am critical towards my opponent. Therefore, I have to remain critical towards my opponent and have opposed this in an argumentative way. Now, because of because I consider my opponent as a serious challenge, I have to take this criticism in a serious way and react to it in order to corroborate my position. So I treat my opponent in a serious way, but since this is a challenge for me, I have an obligation to reply to this challenge. So that means I have to remain in the debate. Also, in the first norm, I grant my opponent a certain leap of faith. I say, okay, I grant you that you may be rational, but I need to recheck this leap of faith along the way. I can't just say, okay, you may be rational, goodbye. I have to keep on examining, right? Are you still rational or not? So I'm critically challenging, along the way of this critical challenge, my opponent can corroborate her own view. This can result in there are three possible outcomes here. Either my opponent keeps on corroborating her view, so she keeps on convincing me that she may be rational, or I end up saying, okay, this is just full of complete nonsense. I asked you full questions, you didn't manage at all to come up with any answers, anything which corresponds to our content and form-based indices. Hence, you pass beyond my disavowal criterion, you're not tolerable anymore. Or third, we can resolve disagreement. Maybe I finally get it. Okay, you're rational. There is no disagreement anymore. Magnani has here a nice point when he says the clash of opposing arguments promotes sound reasoning. It exposes bias and other sources of incompetence in reasoning. So by remaining this challenge, I may be able to expose the bias and incompetence in my opponent because I ask further questions and then get the further information of where my opponent may be wrong. And that, of course, in view of this forming content-based indices. It might take a while till I get the point. So, the importance message of our framework is the tolerance concerns the sustaining of the epistemic tension that comes with rational disagreement. In that sense, we take both poles of the tension, PC and NC, seriously. So we are not trying to resolve this tension. We try to sustain the tension through this notion of toleration because we all the time keep, on the one hand, critical commitment. This is PC. I keep on disagreeing with my opponent. And on the other hand, I keep this negative commitment, namely the fact that there are certain reasons which are convincing me and keep on convincing me that my opponent may be rational after all. It's not complete junk what they're doing, because I have these indices which are convincing me. Now I will not go through this long quote, but let me just say for the end of this talk what are the benefits of our epistemic toleration. We have indicated in the paper two such benefits. One relates to the tradition of which stems from Mill and which Popper and Feyerabend and others have picked up upon, and that is that the best challenge for one theory is to find the critical alternative. The best test for one theory is to find the critical alternative which challenges my theory. So by sustaining the rational disagreement, I allow to take my opponents in a serious way, in which way I'm in the best way testing my own position. The second benefit of our framework regards scientific pluralism, which, as we have already mentioned, a lot of pluralists have, not a lot, but a number of scholars working in pluralism have been using the term toleration, but they have not specified what exactly the normative expectation from a pluralist scientist should be. As we have argued, it's not enough to be indifferent, it's not enough to just speak of different perspectives, we have to take this tension